Assalamu alaikum, welcome to another episode of accidentalmuslims.com. And today, alhamdulillah, we are blessed with a guest from the United States of America, Detroit, Michigan to be exact. Professor Saeed Khan, welcome to the podcast.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to having me.
Thank you. How's South Africa treating you? Or how is Cape Town treating you thus far?
Glorious.
Glorious.
Wonderful place.
Lovely stuff. And I'm sure our friend Nazir, is he acting like a tourist, a proper tourist, or what's
The
happening?
ultimate guide.
Tourist guide, okay. South Africans, if you need to tour Cape Town, come to Nazir.
Yeah.
He is Revolution Pictures, photography, and now Revolution Tourist Group as well. Alhamdulillah. Professor Khan, so you're currently in Cape Town recording the third season of 1400 OMG.
Correct.
Lovely stuff. So let's start with this. Our first question normally to all our guests is, who are you? Introduce yourself to South Africa and to the audience of accidentalmuslims.com.
The real prof.
The real prof,
Yeah.
or the prof behind the prof.
Yeah.
The prof, yeah, the prof.
Right. I'm at Wayne State University in Detroit, where I teach Near Eastern Asian Studies and Global Studies, which essentially means courses within history and politics, but a little bit of culture also. I'm also a research fellow at the university's Center for the Study of Citizenship, and I was a founding member of a think tank in the US which explores the American Muslim community called ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding.
I think perhaps that's a good point of departure. Most of what South Africans and I would suppose everybody that's not in America gets about Muslims in America is through the movies, through the television, maybe it's now and then through the social media. So maybe let's talk about ISPM.
ISPU.
ISPU, excuse me. My handwriting is letting me down there. Let's talk about that a bit. What was the genesis of that organization?
Well, the genesis was actually 2001 and the 9/11 attacks. There was a real curiosity and an interest in Islam at the time, because with the trauma of what was happening to the US, a lot of people then, for some reason, had an awakening to this phenomenon of Islam. And at the same time, it seemed as though they were unfamiliar with even some of the basic tenets, but now they were hearing words like jihad and trying to process all of this and what did it mean, and particularly what did it mean for them as non-Muslims. Well, I recognized that there was still a seat at the table, meaning that there was still an opportunity for Muslims to present the narrative themselves. But what was available at the time was not very satisfactory. On the one hand, you had a lot of people who were what we would now call dyed-in-the-wool Islamophobes, who were setting the agenda by defining not only the terminology, but also the community and the religion. And on the other side of the spectrum were what would be called Muslim apologists, who essentially were saying Islam is a religion of peace and ending it right there. And it was not something that would satisfy someone who was looking for a deeper probe into what all of these very complex issues meant. So as a result of it, and seeing the receptivity of people to genuinely want to learn, I decided to get with a few of my friends and essentially just pitched an idea to them. I said, hey, what do you think about a Muslim think tank? What do you think about an organization which does a few things? One is it shows that the American Muslim community has the same issues, the same challenges, the same concerns, and the same priorities as broader American society, which shows that they're both in line together instead of this anomaly. And the second was to produce research and data which would correct the narrative about Islam and the Muslim community, as well as, hopefully, to then help define the narrative, so that now the barometer of the Muslim community, the standard of the Muslim community, would be in Muslim American hands, taking it away from Islamophobes, taking it away from media outlets who, irrespective of their agenda, were in many cases just making up data about Muslims. And so, alhamdulillah, 18 years on, ISPU has essentially fulfilled what its original vision was, to be the standard bearer of the American Muslim community, so that even if people disagree with what we're producing, they cannot dispute the accuracy and the precision of the data that we're producing.
So the mechanics of it, maybe talk to us about that. It's you and a couple of friends. What's the actual process logistics around what you guys do?
Well, fortunately, we as the founding members have now essentially transitioned out, and we now have a team that is what we would call thoroughly professional. Our research director at ISPU is Dalia Mogahid, who comes to ISPU with a tremendous amount of experience in the world of polling. She was with Gallup for quite some time and brings with her an incredible skill set to then understand how do you not only take an issue, but how to map it, how to frame it, how to then develop the data and the research behind it, how to collect it, how to process it, and then how to provide policy recommendations which can be for the consumption of the American Muslim community, but also for broader society, as well as then providing the necessary framing of an issue for media outlets and others to be able to use. So generally speaking, with ISPU, the process is very simple. If a researcher is interested in a particular issue, they can provide a proposal to ISPU, and if successful, they can become the principal investigator, but they will use ISPU's resources in order to then see that project through and have ISPU as the platform by which they can launch it. The other aspect with ISPU is an examination of what issues ISPU thinks are important. So for example, looking at American Muslims and their voting trends. This has now become an annual project, and ISPU is now recognized both by the Muslim community and broader society as the go-to organization when it comes to looking at Muslim trends when it comes to the political and the civic engagement arenas. So we have then the ability to have a core of topics and issues and therefore data production, but we also can have then, depending on the interests, the appetites, and the trends of the community as well as society as a whole, new areas and new fields of research to explore.
Yeah, I mean, now that you've been in South Africa for a couple of days, I know it's a short time, but I'm sure you've understood and realized that we don't face a huge threat of Islamophobia. It's there, we understand that, but it's not a huge threat to our to the Muslim community. But there are other challenges which are very similar on a global scale, a local scale, but issues that you as ISPU and in your dealings have dealt with. I mean, this kind of research understanding, how pivotal would it be for a country like South Africa, considering our historic apartheid rule and the potential for growing Islamophobia and etc. and other issues within the community dynamics of unity and and disunity? How important would that be for us to start establish something like that if it doesn't exist here?
Well, clearly 9/11 and the growing Islamophobia in the United States was an impetus for the establishment of ISPU. And part of that is also recognizing that even in the pre-9/11 era, the Muslim American community did not prioritize the need to study itself instead of having others study the community and then setting the agenda and defining the community. We were filling in a gap, which in a strange and ironic way, the 9/11 attack simply caused us to think about the importance of this.
Yeah.
We can oftentimes speculate that what and how would the American Muslim community have responded to 9/11 had there already been a think tank in place, but at this point it's academic to consider what wasn't there. In the case of the South African Muslim community, irrespective of the prior history of apartheid and now, thankfully, over the last 25 years, transitioning out of that phase, irrelevant to that is the idea that there are still issues facing the Muslim community here that need to be addressed. And one of those, as you will find in any community, including the United States, is what are the tectonic plates within the American Muslim community. Here you have incredibly diverse communities when it comes to various denominations, various sub-ideologies and directions, external forces that are forcing social dynamics, cultural, socioeconomic, ethnic dynamics that also come into play. Do we simply take these things for granted, or is it important for us to study these aspects of our own community?
Yeah.
I mean, you look, for example, when it comes to Western scholarship, topics like sociology and anthropology, the social sciences and humanities, ones which tend to be viewed with either a dismissive or a disdainful attitude by many Muslim communities, these are providing for understanding of Western society for people who see it as a priority. Now, why is it a priority? Well, it's of course always important to examine one's own community, but also when it comes to the allocation of resources, the recognition and the acknowledgement of issues, flaws, faults, and then hopefully coming up with a prescriptive of how to then solve these issues. As in other issues, it's been said, you cannot pray these issues away. They exist, and it's really incumbent upon the communities to try to figure it out. So, for example, within the South African community, as I'm becoming acquainted with an awful lot of help and guidance from Nazir and from Khalil and yourself, understanding that the Cape Town landscape is completely different from the Durban landscape. What then are some of those issues that we need to go ahead and address? Mapping the community, mapping perhaps the attitudes and perceptions that Muslims have toward one another would be incredibly important, because at that point then, as Muslims, given the fact that we always are asking the question, is unity even possible? Is the acceptance and tolerance of diversity and difference possible? After all, with all of these divisions, we not only then have the prospect of our overall strength being weakened and depleted, but also the fact that community resources may be doubled, tripled, quadrupled, instead of becoming more efficient and streamlined with them. So as a result of that, to go ahead and then take a look at when we're talking about the community, what do we really mean by the community? That would be very helpful to then examine, as well as trying to understand how do Muslims feel about each other. What level of silos are they living in, especially now with social media, the way that technology and communication are, which makes it so easy to fall into a cocoon or a silo. How is that then having an impact on the Muslim community overall? That kind of research is invaluable.
I think that's definitely food for thought. And I read a article that you wrote previously. And,
okay, that's dangerous.
and it's just something that you maybe I'm paraphrasing from it. And I think it touches onto what you're saying, is that we're living in a time where Islam and Muslim identities are being contested in many countries. And for me, what was interesting was this question around Muslim identity. I mean, whether it's Cape Town, we have a certain way of doing things, Durban, Johannesburg, Michigan, wherever. What's the importance of owning the identity of or Muslim identity? Is there such a thing as a Muslim identity, do you think?
I think that even if there isn't one particular Muslim identity or a mandated Muslim identity, Muslims nonetheless will go ahead and define a Muslim identity, and sometimes do so in very exclusivistic terms. Just as dangerously, they make it very reductive. So when somebody says that they are a Muslim, generally speaking nowadays they don't stop at just saying that they're a Muslim. They will qualify it with any number of adjectives, and those adjectives are a basis of denomination. Sometimes they will go ahead and bring in domestic political terminology. For example, they'll say, I'm a progressive Muslim, or I'm a conservative Muslim. They will go ahead then and also maybe shy away from wanting to include their nationality as part of their Muslim identity, or sometimes they will want to go ahead and celebrate that, even if it's transplanted. Someone living in South Africa and claiming to be an Indian Muslim even though they are 5 generations in South Africa. Sometimes these kinds of terminologies are incredibly instructive with seeing where a community is and how it perceives itself. The other issue is that there's the challenge of reductivism. If people are going to go ahead and say, I'm such and such Muslim, oftentimes that comes with a mic drop, saying, that's it, deal with it, go ahead and take me on my terms. They may not necessarily themselves have a full understanding of what that term means. And here, if they want then somebody to see nothing beyond that term, that becomes self-defeating in many cases. And perhaps most damning is that when we're taking a look at Muslim identity, the way that it is negotiated and contested, both within the community and outside it, is to say that I am this. It doesn't really say anything about imbuing the values of Islam and the spirit of Islam. Islam at that point becomes reduced to simply a badge that is worn on someone's lapel as a way to transact with other people in a social setting.
Yeah, I mean, and that comes to specifically young people when you speak about identity. In South Africa, we've got a growing large number of young people, specifically Muslim, and that amount of integration that exists. A lot of like myself personally, coming from a Muslim private school and then integrating into a open university where you've got cultures and religions and races, that change for many of my friends, actually most of my friends, was very difficult. I mean, that was just not a time. They would stick to their silos, stick to their own kind of friends, and still to today. But when they get to the real world and a working world, then you're no more with your friends. They're all in different companies. They find that struggle, right? Is this a global thing? Is it the same in the US? Is now that you had something and it was a negative thing that brought you together, in the sense the fact that 9/11 happened. We don't have that, and young people still continue to continue this way. Is there solutions that you have from the US, or situations where you say, hey, this kind of worked? What do you say about that?
Well, first of all, when you're looking at asking, is this a global phenomenon, I think the answer is yes. That people are definitely moving into their silos. They are forming cocoons. They're finding this to be an area of safety. But again, it's important to ask the question, why?
Yeah.
We know what is facilitating it, and that is technology, social media, communications, etc. But more importantly, I think what's important to recognize is that I would contest there are two related issues. One is what we're seeing is a reduction in intellectual curiosity. Now that might be out of a sense of fear that people might learn something that they don't want to. And the other, which is related to that, is intellectual laziness.
Okay.
I really don't want to put the effort into the exercise of learning something.
Yeah.
If I'm just going to go ahead and get the answer from Siri or Google.
Yeah.
I'm not going to take the time and study the cause and effect, the why and the how behind something.
Yes.
It's just going to be the what, where, when, because I don't have time for anything else. As they say in this day and age, I don't have the bandwidth for these. Now you see in many Muslim communities, especially those that are living in the so-called West, part of this is actually unfortunately ingrained by parents, it is ingrained by community leaders, it is ingrained by religious leaders. Don't go there, don't learn about that, for fear that people might become susceptible to it, tempted by it.
Yeah.
Oftentimes you see it's because the authority figures perhaps don't want to be addled with having to explain it themselves.
Yeah.
And part of that may be either their own intellectual lack of curiosity or laziness, or because they don't have an answer themselves to go ahead and provide it because they don't understand it themselves. So when you see that happening to a community like Muslims that live in minority settings, particularly in the West, there is no luxury for that kind of attitude and for that approach. If dominant cultures and dominant societies are intellectually lazy and not curious, it may not really faze them as much, because they still control the levers of power and they still control the cultural zeitgeist, as you would say. At the same time, why it's important for them to be more intellectually curious is that if they are then ignorant to, say, a Muslim community, there's a greater likelihood that they will be susceptible to fear, they will be susceptible to anxiety, and they will then take on a very negative attitude and perception